Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, we've had recent advancements by the Russian forces as they continue their operations in the direction of Terny, here to the northwest of Kreminna, in the Luhansk-Kharkiv-Donetsk border. We see that the Russian forces continue their operations in the direction of the village of Terny, where we see continuous efforts by the Russian forces to push through the forest patches and forest lines here to the east of Terny, trying to reach the outskirts of the village. We see continuous attempts by the Russian forces, both here in the Terny directions and previously in the direction of Torske and Sarishne, here to the west of Kreminna, to reach the Serebets River and create a front line by it. Serebets River spans from the northwest of Svatove, here in this direction, down through Selmahivka and down through the front line really, down all the way to Torske. This Serebets River is one where we see that the Ukrainians have two positions across the Serebets River, one in the north to the northwest of Svatove, where they have a small section to the east of Sermahivka, where they are fighting by Novoselivske, and have their positions here by the river line by Sermahivka, Mieso-Harivka, and Andrivka. All of these positions are positions where the Russians and the Ukrainians are fighting heavily over the parts that are across the Serebets River. The Russians have one position across the Serebets River, and it's here in the central parts to the southwest of Svatove, where they have these fields and hills to the west of the Serebets River, and this one village of Serhivka, which is very small and hardly noticeable. So these positions are all what the Russians have across the Serebets River. So we're seeing that the Russians had two operations, first in the fall season and in the summer, where they fought over Novoselivske and tried to reach Selmahivka here in the northwest of Svatove to try and close this small section of the front across the Serebets River the Ukrainians hold control of, but they failed to reach the river line after months of fighting, with Stormset units taking the brunt of the casualties while they were storming the Ukrainian positions in Novoselivske. They managed to gain control over the village, but since then the Ukrainians have attempted counterattacks and have reached the outskirts of it again. So we're seeing continuous efforts by the Ukrainians to regain control over the village and push the Russians in this section, despite the Russians having a lot of units, a lot of troops, a lot of equipment in this section. The main reason for this is that the Russians, although they have a lot of forces in the area, they aren't really committing that much. Their strategy in this section of the front line is what they call active defense, and that is whenever they see an opening in the Ukrainian defenses, they take advantage of that to try and push them out of important positions, such as Novoselivske. While at the rest of the time, they are really just doing defensive operations, trying to prevent any Ukrainian advances in the area, and just try to fight some positional fights to gain a better position. So the fights here is focused around defensive operations rather than offensive operations. So what they're committing is really all that is needed to hold their positions, while they sometimes rotate units to conduct offensive operations if they find a favorable fight where Ukrainians are vulnerable. Similar to the Novoselivske area, where a lot of fighting has taken place, and the reason why they started attacking this section of the front line is because they saw that the Ukrainian forces in the area were vulnerable, so they started sending Stormset units to storm those positions, after which they had some fire support from Russian tank regiments of the 4th Guards tank division here in the direction of Svatove. So we're seeing continuous Russian efforts with these fire support units to hold and support the Russian fighters in the area as they try to get better positions. Similar to that, we have the Senkivka direction, where I analyzed a positional fighting, a assault of Russian forces in the Senkivka direction. It turns out that the infantry that they dropped into the village were Stormset units, and the armored vehicles were of the Russian tank army. So we're seeing that the Russian tanks are the more elite units, and they just drop the infantry, which are quote-unquote disposable, to fight these fights and try to gain a foothold before they send the brunt of their forces. So really what we're seeing is that the Russians are sending their disposable units and trying to exchange these disposable units to detect the Ukrainian positions before they launch artillery strikes and other long-range strikes on the Ukrainian positions to try and exchange their own disposable units for the more professional and useful units of the Ukrainian army. This is, of course, a very cruel and terrible way to use war, and it is based on my own deduction based on the information that we have Stormset units in this area, and we know that Stormset units are based on former prisoners, and we also know that they have been using them as stormtroopers, so it makes a lot of sense for them to be the ones who have less training, less equipment, and more disposable than professional Russian soldiers who were either mobilized or volunteers from the different Russian regions. Based on that information, it would make more sense for that to be disposable units rather than being proper Russian armed forces who are sent to their deaths, because that is what they really were. Moving further south in the direction of Bakhmut, we see that the Russians have managed to advance further in Spirne, where they've managed to gain control over the farmhouses here to the southeast of the village. We see that the Russians are continuing their attempts at getting control over Spirne after they managed to gain control over this area 2 days ago, and now this part over the past 24 hours. So we're seeing continuous attempts by the Russians here. We also see that managed to advance here to the northeast of Vesele through the forest lines, the railways, and the forest patches here in the northeastern direction. So we're seeing continuous attempts by the Russians to reach Vyemka here to the northwest of the positions the Russians have by Berestova, Belorivka, and so on. So there are continuous attempts by the Russians to advance in the Siversk direction. This could also be more of the active defense strategy, where they likely saw the Ukrainians being weakened or vulnerable in this direction after the heavy pressure in the central parts of Donetsk in the direction of Avdiivka and Marinka, taking a lot of troops from these directions in rotations to deal with the increasing Russian pressure in the area. And since the Russians have a lot of extra soldiers currently available throughout the front line, they could rotate some to this section and use them here for some offensive operations during the time that the Ukrainians are weaker here and stronger elsewhere. So we're seeing continuous efforts by the Russians to take advantage of any vulnerability the Ukrainians reveal. We see continuous fighting in Bakhmut, but no territorial changes. The same with Avdiivka and Marinka, where the fighting is more of the same. First up in the direction of Avdiivka, we saw some advancement by the Russians, but since then there's been no reports of changes here. Throughout the month of December, we have seen that they've made advances in multiple sections. The interesting part is the southeast by the industrial zone, where the Russians managed to get a foothold within the residential area of Avdiivka, but there's been no real reports since, which indicates that there's likely a more artillery-based, more positional-based fighting rather than actual advances by the Russians. This is likely due to either rotations, exhaustion from the fighting, since the one thing about industrial and residential fighting in urban areas is that it is very exhausting. It's very taxing for the forces in the area, especially if they have to go through these long routes to actually get supplies. Therefore, we see that it is going to be very slow fighting until the front line expands, because at that point you'll have much more secure supply lines, and therefore they'll have the ability to use a lot more soldiers in the section rather than the few that they have available in the area. Since the Russians have a lot of troops available, they just do not have the necessary capacity to send them to the front. That is mainly due to the Ukrainian attacks on Russian supply lines, but also due to the complexity of such operations and missions. So we're seeing continuous Russian efforts in the Severne Avdiivka direction to try and increase their zone of control and expand their flanks to secure the flanks and try to hit the Ukrainian supply lines, because if they completely cut off the supply lines with their encroaching, as they call it, stranglehold of Avdiivka, then the Ukrainian fighters will become more and more tired, more exhausted, and it will become more difficult for them to continue holding on to the city. As Zelensky himself said, they expect the city to fall within the next 2 to 3 months. So by the end of winter, Avdiivka would have fallen, according to Zelensky. So we're seeing that the fighting here is very taxing on the Ukrainian forces. And at the same time, we had a massive missile strike all throughout Ukraine over the past 24 hours, specifically through the night, where Russian bombers and Russian planes and Russian ships and whatever else have missiles available shot at Ukrainian targets all throughout the country, mainly focused around Dnipro, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Zaporizhia, and Kiev, where they hit pretty much everything military related, from deployment points, training centers, ammunition depots, and everything else in between. There were also some that misfired or were hit by Ukrainian air defense, which ended up hitting civilian areas, but that is unavoidable when you use that many missiles, really. Of course, it's not acceptable, but it is unavoidable nonetheless. And that is where I'm going to end off this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.